Welcome everyone to today's webinar. I am Brian Zimmerman, Custom Content Editor for Becker's Healthcare. We'll begin today's webinar with a presentation and we'll have time at the end of the hour for a question and answer session. You can submit any questions you have throughout the webinar by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled Enter a Question for Staff and clicking Send. We look forward to hearing your questions. Additionally, in about a week following the webinar, we'll be sending you a copy of the presentation to the email you used to register. To start, I'm going to turn the floor over to Naya Kihayes, Principal of ECG Management Consultants, to begin today's presentation.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here. I wanted to move on to the next slide and just make some introductions on the agenda. So we have, for today, we have introductions and then followed by the value of the business case, developing a payer strategy, and building the business case. And then we will move on to how to present the business case, and we will leave time for some Q&A with the audience. Moving on to introductions, I am pleased to be here, and I am the principal of the ambulatory surgery practice at ECG Management Consultants. Today, I am pleased to have Greg DeCancelius back with me from Boston Outpatient Surgical Suites. Greg, could you please share a few comments with the audience about your background?
Sure, thanks, Naya. Yes, this is Greg DeCancelius. I am the administrator of Boston Outpatient Surgical Suites. We're a multi-specialty ASC in the Metro West Boston area. We primarily perform orthopedic and pain management cases. Have been doing it for, since we opened it, about almost 15 years here. Thanks for having me.
Great, thank you very much. And we're also very happy to have Kevin Dowdy here with us today, who is the Regional Director of Managed Care from Envision Healthcare. Kevin, could you please share with the audience a bit about your background?
Sure. Thank you, Naya. Hi, this is Kevin Dowdy. I'm the Regional Director of Managed Care for Envision Healthcare. I currently handle managed care contracting responsibilities for 43 AMSurg ASCs located in the Northeast. Prior to joining Envision, I've worked for several other ASC management companies, and most recently came from Cigna, where I developed value-based payment programs focusing on migrating cases to ASCs. Those programs included bundle payment methodology and a surgeon incentive program. Thank you, Naya.
Thank you very much. Before we dive into the meeting today, I want to flip to the next slide. We have a few faculty disclosures we would like to review. The faculty have consulting relationships with Pacira Biosciences. The program is not accredited for continuing medical education, and attendees will not receive CME credit. The program is sponsored by Pacira Biosciences. And now we'll move on to the next slide, and just want to do a quick session one recap. This is a part 2 to session 1. However, it is not required for attendees to have participated in session 1, but wanted to give a brief overview of the session, which occurred on April 15th and was entitled Payer Contract Negotiation Preparation. The following were some of the topics that we reviewed in the first session. Reviewing your contracts to understand the key terms and methodologies. We reviewed the Medicare outpatient prospective payment system, outpatient groupers, proprietary fee schedules, and carve-outs and other salient features of terms and methodologies that are used in ASC contracting. We also reviewed demonstrating the value to commercial payers as a result of Medicare reimbursement and the ASC rule changes. We focus primarily there on 4 fundamentals: device-intensive code changes, the approval of non-opioid separate and distinct reimbursement for Exparel, the hospital market index update that was given to ASCs, as well as the cardiac cath lab codes that were added to the ASC surgery list. And then we also reviewed utilizing your payer mix and case mix to support your business case and how this is important to your conversations and discussions with payers and understanding the most impactful data to collect. We'll dig deeper into some of these topics today and expand upon them as we're going into the development and presentation of the business case. Now I'd like to move on to the next slide and talk about the objectives for today's section. We will primarily focused on key steps to building a business case for successful payer contract negotiations. We will highlight considerations for strategy, structure, and communication. We will illustrate the value of building a business case tailored to each payer and your facility's profile. We will talk about targeting specific payers and understanding variations in reimbursement methodology and how that may impact your approach. We'll review components of an effective business case. We will focus here on discussing high-cost supplies, implants, and XBRA relative to building a business case. And then finally, we will talk about how you use the business case to successfully negotiate reimbursement changes in your contracts with payers. So moving on to the next section, I would like to talk about the value of the business case. Subsequent to each component of the next few sections, I will then turn the floor over to Kevin and Greg for some questions. But first, I want to talk about the value of the business case and provide a brief overview. Developing a business case is a useful exercise to organize and present material to the payer to support the need for reimbursement. There are several things to think about. What is a business case? It illustrates the importance of covering the cost of high-cost items, such as XBRA, bupivacaine liposome injectable suspension, as well as high-cost supplies and implants. It identifies cases that may experience increased utilization that were previously performed in the hospital, which represents an opportunity for payers and providers to potentially move volume and save money, perhaps for the patient and the payer. It provides the ability to look at detailed case utilization information, which will afford the surgery center a sound argument and discussion with the payer. It supports utilization of Medicare as a standard for reimbursement guidelines when it is applicable to the payer. Every payer has a different methodology, and sometimes Medicare guidelines are important to point out, especially when a payer does not follow the Medicare reimbursement methodology. It supports payer reimbursement, using other payers as an example, reminding everyone not to disclose any contract terms or payment methods of other payers, but there are certainly times where we can provide an overview and summary of the types of things that may be advantageous to discussing an effective business case with the payer. The business case also illustrates outcomes related to patient satisfaction, and specifically, we're going to talk about how that might apply with XBRA. Data access and availability will impact the types of analysis that can be provided to support the business case. Now, following this overview, I'd like to turn it over to some questions. Greg, can you describe some key elements needed to develop a business case for the payer based upon your experience?
Yeah, thanks, Naya. I think you hit almost all the key elements. In the past, what we've done, really emphasizing those shift of cases from a higher cost, supposed hospital setting to a lower cost ASC setting is really, really key for us, identifying those physicians that are bringing the cases, et cetera. But also, as you mentioned, that the outcome piece is really, really key. So, presenting or giving information back to them on kind of the benefits of bringing those cases over, only, with positive outcomes, but also with things like patient satisfaction. One of the things that I think if folks are moving over to XBRA, we've done is also looking at your patient satisfaction survey. A lot of people use customized surveys, but I'm sure that they can customize them as well. And so, within those surveys, you can, I think, put a question there regarding, specific to XBRA. So if the patient has received XBRA, yes or no, and if yes, it would kind of trigger a pain score. And you can also, do before and after. Or different post-op periods. And then you can even tie in things, I was thinking of things like, opioid use. I mean, that was really, really key. I found that the payers are really looking at, opioid use and strategies to reduce opioids. And so if you capture that data, then report back to them, I think it'd be really, really, really key. Key component of what you're doing in creating that business case. And so, that's just an option in terms of patient satisfaction. Customizing it to include those questions would be important.
Thank you, Greg. I appreciate your response. I think those are very, very important key factors. I'd like to turn it over to Kevin and ask Kevin, what is the most important data needed to create a business case? And it would be helpful if you could give us your perspective, as a professional in managed care on both the payer and the provider side of the house.
Sure, thanks, Naya. And both you and Greg referenced some very important items. I just want to touch on a couple of key items that I think of when it comes to developing a business case, especially when looking to migrate cases out of hospital settings. So the one, understand your volume, the universe of cases that can be targeted for migration to the ASC, understand why those cases are at the hospital today, things like comorbidity or referral patterns, physician's convenience, but also know which hospitals those cases are coming from. I think that's very important, and certainly that's important information to share when you have your meeting with your payers to discuss. And then certainly don't shy away from estimating savings opportunities as a result of those volume shifts. And those are key kind of metrics, but one thing I do want to point out is I think quality data from when developing value-based models on the payer side, quality data was one of those key items, and there's a lot of quality metrics out there, but at the end of the day, it felt like the payers were looking more towards readmission rates, especially when looking at the migration of high acuity cases. Tracking patients postoperatively can be difficult, especially when outside of the scope of the surgery center, but just know that the payers have all of that cost information, and they are certainly taking a look at it. When there's, the post-op complications the cost can be extensive in framing quality in the terms of like cost mitigation may sound odd to us, but the expectation from the health plan side is that the quality of care will be the same, if not better, than provided at the hospital.
Great. Thank you so much, Kevin. I'd like to move on now to section 3, which is developing a payer strategy. So if we move on to the next slide, it is very, very important that you do your homework. The ASC should understand what payment methodology a payer will follow during negotiations to prepare for discussions with the commercial payers. Step 1, identify target payers for reimbursement negotiation. Sometimes when you're adding new cases or you've got a problem with a payment system, it's not necessarily applicable to all payers. So it's really important to look at, which payers comprise the largest percentage of the facility's case mix, and which ones are the most problematic, and which ones are the most beneficial for the ASC to renegotiate with. Reflecting back to our first session a little bit here, it's important really to understand the payer mix relative to the case mix as well and the payment methodology. So that moves us on to step 2, reviewing each payer's specific reimbursement methodology and implications for approach and strategy. As we've talked about in the past, there's really no two payers that follow the same methodology. If you've got a payer that is on a percentage of Medicare, some of the things that you should consider and the questions you should be asking yourself when you're looking at your contract and or when you're having preliminary discussions with the payer is, if the contract is currently on Medicare or it states it's on a percentage of Medicare, does that reimbursement cover the cost of doing the services that you're providing based upon the percentage of Medicare that's in the contract? Is that contract on current Medicare? Is it on 2019, 2018, 2017? What are the implications of the year? What is the percentage of Medicare that may be reasonable and appropriate for the case types, the case mix? A lot of people will say, okay, what's 1% of Medicare that's appropriate for the contract? Yet there quite often isn't 1% if you're in a multi-specialty center, because there are different percentages you may need based upon the case mix. But understand the aggregate or the weighted average is important by looking at your case mix relative to the methodology. The next methodology, if you've got contracts based upon an outpatient grouper, which is really, a payer-defined grouping system, quite often based upon the old Medicare groupers and augmented, is to look at how are the codes paid if they are not on the payer's grouper list. And how often is that list updated? Do you have the complete mapping and list of codes that are in each grouper? If you're up for renegotiation and your contract is a few years old, do you have the most current list? Do you have the list that's going to be used on the next contract negotiation? These are all important questions to think about and to ask. And if you're missing some of these items, ask the payer before getting into that deep negotiation, because it will impact your approach. Fixed fee schedules. How are codes paid if they are not on the fixed fee schedule of the payer? There are some, payers that will basically line item every CPT code and say, here's the reimbursement rate, i.e. a fixed fee schedule. Is the fee schedule at all based upon Medicare? Meaning, do they use the ASC Medicare list? Do they have their own list? Do they update the list? Are they willing to add codes to that fee schedule? Is the fee schedule automatically updated? Some payers, and this will apply to any methodology, some payers will automatically update January 1. Some may update quarterly. Some may update, later on in the year. Others may not update until you renegotiate your contract. So it's very important to understand when the payers update their methodologies and their fee schedule, or the basis for the fee schedule. And then will the payment be based upon a percentage of a baseline fee schedule, or is it really truly customized to your facility? Carve-outs. Do you have carve-outs in your existing contract? If you were on the first call, carve-outs, were when you delineate from the payer's methodology. You may carve out an implant. You may carve out a CPT code for different rates that deviate from the contract payment structure and methodology. And so it's important to understand before you even embark on a negotiation if the payer is willing to allow carve-outs, if they can administer carve-outs. If they can't, you probably won't succeed at presenting carve-outs as an option, and you'll have to think about other alternatives. If they can, then this should be factored into your approach. Is there a multiple year contract term, and do you get increases or automatic escalators when you negotiate your contract? And will those increases also apply to carve-outs? Some payers may specifically require the language to have the escalator apply to both the base methodology as well as the carve-out. So it's important to understand if those escalators apply to both. So moving on to slide 12, it is important for an ASC to understand all aspects of a payer contract in addition to the methodology that the payer will follow during negotiations. Step 3, evaluate the payer strategy and approach options, keeping the following in mind. What methodology will be used as the basis for the current negotiation, despite what you've got historically on your contract? What historically has been that methodology was just talked about in general, but also consider multiple procedures. If you're a surgery center that has case volume that is subject to a lot of multiple procedures, it is important to understand, do they follow Medicare logic? Do they have their own multiple procedure logic? And what will the new contract entail with respect to multiple procedures? Will the payer allow for carve-outs? We just discussed that. Will the contract be evergreen, which means will it continue to roll over if you don't renegotiate it at the end of a term? Or is it for a fixed term? So is it a 2-year contract and it comes to an end and it forces you to renegotiate? If it's a fixed term and multi-year contract is negotiated, will the payer negotiate escalators? Is the payer willing to renegotiate, or are you stuck on the same methodology and the same terms forever? Meaning some payers, it forces ASCs to enter into a termination, while most of us would like to just renegotiate. When you've got a payer that is not willing to negotiate and it has a term that keeps going on with no increase in rates, these are things that you really need to consider relative to a payer strategy. So understanding the methodology, its limitations and or opportunities will impact the approach on developing an effective business case. So now I'd like to flip it over to a question for Kevin. Kevin, what are the most effective approaches to developing a payer strategy?
Thanks, Naya. And, first to start with, I like the 3-step approach. That certainly is very organized and helps kind of frame what your objectives are. And so speaking of, when expecting what that approach should be to meet those objectives is I think the most effective way is to work within the construct of the respective payer's payment methodology. You mentioned several previously, be it percentage of Medicare, be it fixed fee, et cetera. But at the end of the day, I think the devil's in the details with respect to those different methodologies. You mentioned a couple, like if you're using a percentage of Medicare, what year are you using, and will it be updated annually? If you're using Medicare, does it apply to items like Exparel? If you're make sure you understand your coding and how that affects the multiple procedure logic. Based on the multiple procedure discounting, do you need to front load the primary procedure? Do you need to, understand how multiple procedure logic extends to carve-outs, implants, drugs, et cetera? And then certainly within that multiple procedure realm, understand the in-one payment indicator and kind of how that will affect your target rate. Now, you also mentioned things like rate escalators. I think those are very important to understand as far as how those are applied across the base rate versus carve-outs, et cetera. And what I'd add, just with that said, it is okay to propose something outside the payer's payment methodology, but just be cognizant of the implications of that. And then let me add one more thing, and I'll wrap up here, and that's when you're doing your homework, make sure you look at transparency tools like Healthcare Blue Book that are out there to help with setting pricing, and also use tools that CMS uses as far as like intensive procedure percentages and also hospital DRG rates. All of that can help when you're developing your strategy. Thanks, Naya.
Thank you, Kevin. That was outstanding. I'd like to move on to section 4 and discuss building the business case. So when we move on to slide 15, we're going to start with the data collection, and we're going to dig a little deeper into this on collecting data over a period of time that is long enough to identify trends that will support a business case for payer contract negotiations. A lot of people think, oh, the payer has all the information. And while they may have the information, it is important to understand that it is very, very time-consuming process. And typically, you will lag and you will create longer periods of time if you're waiting for the payer to look at their data. It is very important to collect data. And some of the key items you want to look at is identify physicians and case types that use Exparel, as well as cost data and implants and high-cost supplies and or utilization of high-cost supplies and implants on specific cases. Any extraordinary items, this may also be applicable to things like laser use fees. Any extraordinary item that increases the cost of a case that may not be included, for separate reimbursement and or is impacting your ability to do a case, it makes you pause and think about when you're renegotiating a contract. This often can be also triggered by the opportunity to do new cases. So case volume before and after adoption of Exparel. If you've adopted Exparel due to the change in the Medicare rule, it's important to start tracking that and looking at what has happened, with respect to the utilization of the center for even the Medicare patient population. Has it, and for payers that provide adequate reimbursement, so the ASC can demonstrate the impact by way of example. If you've had changes in practice patterns, especially if you've had physicians bring more cases from the hospital to the ASC and you can demonstrate that, that will be very, very important. So that moves us on to that third bullet, the volume transition trends from HOPD to ASC with other payers, and blinding that data, of course, because we don't want to disclose other payer information. So if they have, if other payers have adequate reimbursement and it allows you to move cases, from the hospital, it's important to demonstrate that. And then as Greg spoke, in more detail earlier, patient satisfaction scores are very important. Payers are very inclined and very much wanting outcomes data from ASCs. There's not a lot of information, and so patient satisfaction scores can be very, very important to that conversation. Identify data that supports a favorable outcome, such as those pain scores that Greg talked about. Redesign your survey if needed to approach these items that you've got concerns about. If the ASC has experience with patients who have received Exparel, it would be advantageous to maybe add a few new questions as Greg outlined. So I want to move on to slide 16 and talk a little bit about data presentation and how you build the business case with data and how you organize the data into tables that might help identify case types that experience increased utilization and help support, use Medicare as a standard if those reimbursement guidelines will help you, because it's public information. And that's, that you can disclose that. You can talk about public information to help you. And so Medicare may actually help you with some of this. So in the first table 1, this is really just showing a profile, of 4 physicians in a surgery center that introduced Exparel and what their utilization looked like. And overall, in this example, it shows a 48% increase. It also shows the difference in the number of cases that used Exparel. versus, before when the surgery center wasn't using Exparel. And in table 2, we have specific case type utilization showing, okay, these are the types of cases that used Exparel and what happened to the volume in the surgery center. So this is a really meaningful information, or can be very meaningful information, again, especially if some of those cases came from the hospital, because I think that demonstrates, additional potential savings for the payer, but it also shows the payer, look at how the patients that got a non-opioid option that may have had, intense opioids before. And this helps demonstrate, that support of providing the surgical services with a non-opioid option for pain management. In the bottom table, if you've got, if you want to use Medicare, or how you can use Medicare sometimes to demonstrate value, is, in this example, we're showing, if hospital reimbursement were at 150% of Medicare HOPD, and suppose the ASC reimbursement or payments are at 200% of Medicare ASC, even with the increase in reimbursement attributed to Exparel, this example shows how the surgery center is 20 to 32% less. And so these are the types of data and information that can have a meaningful impact on the payer. And of course, there are others. So I'd like to flip it over to the next slide and ask Greg a little bit about his experience. Greg, how did Boss build a strong business case in a situation? If you could describe maybe where you had minimal or no data available, maybe adding a new service and you don't have, existing experience with it. And then also if you can touch on what resources have you used to prepare, has Boss used to prepare and help analyze data, that would be great.
Sure, and I'll take both questions together, because I think this is the reality of most cases. When you're bringing a new service line or a new procedure or new product, whatever it is, you don't have that data. And so I think it's important for people to realize they can lean on some resources. I'm sure the physician who introduced this to you as the administrator who wants to bring this to the center, you can, you get some utilization data and some outcome data that they've experienced already. I think that's helpful. So lean on those physicians for those resources. Costing-wise, lean on the vendors for, what different pricing may be, et cetera, so you know kind of where your structure is going into it on the cost side. Also, there's a lot of research out there. So we'll talk in a bit about total joints and bringing total joints to the ASC. I mean, if you go to any conference, it's always a subject there, or there's, white papers out there and a lot of information online and other resources, through networking you can gain to gather their information to use when you're building your business case. And then finally, I just mentioned, there are a lot of third-party consultants out there, people who actually do this professionally, negotiate contracts, have access to the data, can put all this together for you. And frankly, we're all very, very busy. And if you don't have a management company to lean on or those types of situations, it might be better just, turn to a third party, because the amount of money you spend for that consultant can come back to you, 100-fold. So, don't be afraid. You're not alone with this stuff.
Great. Thank you, Greg. I'd like to now move on to section 5, which is presenting the business case. And we are going to move on to slide 19 and talk about communication and timeline. Payer negotiations can take 6 to 12 months or more to complete. So it is important to set realistic timeline expectations for achieving final contracted rates when you're negotiating with payers. It can be a long and cumbersome process, and I just want to provide some overview of why that may be, and what are some of the steps to take along the way. So in step 1, it's important to create a communication plan, an approach for the payer that allows the key arguments for forwarding reimbursement of Exparel, as well as other high-cost items if that's your situation. If you're looking to add coverage for implants or high-cost supplies or Exparel, it's important to provide examples and talk about and think about how you're going to communicate that. Step 2, request feedback from the payer if they're willing to provide it. Step 3, gather any feedback from the payer in advance of a meeting to discuss reimbursement. It's so important that you're prepared. And hold a meeting with the payer to review the key arguments and prepare for a proposal for reimbursement. Step 5, follow up with the payer as appropriate to secure reimbursement changes. The negotiation process is long. You could go 3, 4, 5 rounds of negotiations. And again, collecting that data, demonstrating the value, a lot of that is part of this, impacts this timeline. So the time between the steps will vary based upon the contracting specifics of each center, and also based upon the responsiveness of the payer. So when we go on to slide 20, we have a case study that is about a total knee arthroplasty, and I think has some similar resemblances to Greg's experience at Boss. So I'd like to turn this slide over to Greg to kind of outline, this scenario and some of the approach, both what the scenarios in pre-negotiation and prepping for those meetings with the payers.
Sure. Thanks, Naya. Yeah, as you mentioned, this is a hypothetical situation, but this looked much like what we were dealing with a couple of years ago with analyzing what kind of volume we had to start. We talked about this already, where how many of those cases that are already being done at the hospital now, and we're going to make that shift, would be eligible. So we looked at about 5% of our cases were eligible based on the criteria we had for admission, as far as health goes and risk factors. And also given the fact that a lot of, the aging population is Medicare based. And so, we only had access really to those commercial payers and the ones we'd be negotiating the contracts for. And so as we move through it, we analyze how many cases we thought we move over to present our case, how many surgeons would be providing that, where they'd be coming from, those cases would be shifting from. And then, what players, as far as the insurance carriers, we would actually approach. Pre-negotiation, I think this is very, very key. We put together a case of internal stakeholders, as they call them here, the surgeons, the anesthesiologists, nursing staff, management, anybody who kind of touches the patient. Now, don't forget about people like physical therapy and the home care and those that have touched that afterwards. You have to build that whole story for that payer when you go in front of them, or as I like to call it, the clinical pathway, including items like patient selection. And then also, when you're going to have in your bag of tricks there all the data to support the negotiations. You have to know your costs. And again, I already mentioned going to the vendors for some of your direct costs, your implant costs, those types of things. But don't forget about your indirect costs, all your capital equipment, and those items you're going to have to get that maybe aren't directly related to that case in some fashion as on a per case basis, but an overall basis. And so all those things you have to know, again, where your costs land, what it costs you to actually do that procedure. And then you'll have to know what the hospital is getting paid. And for us, we were fortunate that we have a very engaged group of docs. And some of those docs had asked, some of their staff, some of their patients to provide their EOB data. And so, again, I mentioned earlier about going to, there's national data out there on costing. But, if you have concrete numbers on what the hospital is actually getting paid, it's really, really helpful because then you know your costs and you know what the hospital is going to getting paid. And then you can look at kind of where you expect to land. And if we go to the next slide, I think Naya can elaborate more on specifics in terms of, again, hospital inpatient total need data that we know and where those ranges lie.
Yep. Thank you so much, Greg. I wanted to then go on to the case study as Greg was describing and how you approach the payers with the goal of negotiating a win-win scenario. I think it's also important to understand that with respect to, what the hospital cost is, or what the hospital is getting paid, that's not easy information to obtain. But like Greg said, if you've got physicians that have queried some of their patients or have information from patients who have experienced, the total knee or other cases you're trying to move, from the hospital to the ASC, that's very, very powerful information to have because the reimbursement or the amount, on that hospital EOB is what it costs the payer versus what it really costs to do the surgery. So the cost to the payer and the opportunity for the ASC to present a savings to the payer is very, very important to the conversation. It's also important, as Greg said, if you can't get that type of information, there is public information out there. There's HOPD, Medicare information, DRG information, also workers' comp. If you've got, workers' comp plans quite often are public, you can look at that. And so when you've got public information, use it to help you demonstrate that value of the ASC. So in this hypothetical situation and we look at hospital benchmarking, the ASC reviewed its contracts, and some commercial payers will have allowances for total knee arthroplasty, but the reimbursement in this situation was only at $7,500, most likely because the ASC had never negotiated for total knee because they historically had not performed these cases. As noted on the previous slide, they were looking at approximately 100 cases that could move from 6 surgeons from hospitals. So the hospital reimbursement, based upon the information that they collected, was ranged between $31,000 to $69,000. So it was a substantial high cost case for the payers in the market. So the TKA reimbursement in ASC at a rate of $20,000. So they went out, said, look, we can do it for $20,000. The magnitude of the savings in that situation, was $11,000 to $49,000 a case. So $1.1 million to $4.9 million, which also, which covers the cost of doing TKA and the implant and Exparel in this situation. So these are very meaningful numbers. Every ASC is different, though. Every market is different. Those ranges could look very different depending upon the market. And obviously the cost is highly dependent upon the surgeons, their practice patterns, what they utilize, and the capital outlay, as Greg suggested. So it's very important to consider, when you're looking at these things and you're trying to add things like TKA reimbursement to the fee schedule and or any other type of new case, that you understand these factors if you can get access to the information. And again, use public information if you cannot, if you do not have the opportunity to understand, what the hospital may be, what's costing the hospital with other commercial payers. So moving on to the next slide, we've got a couple of questions that I want to approach. The first question to Greg, how long have contract negotiations or renegotiations taken at BOSS? And in your opinion, are there any ways to speed up the process?
Yeah, and I think you've already did a really nice job outlining the timeline and maybe setting the expectation. And for those who have done this already, they know that's the reality. Unfortunately, these things take a while, and so that should be your expectation. I think for us, some of the things that have helped us in the past, or for me, is as we've already mentioned, putting that case, doing your homework, putting that case together for the payer already, kind of making that argument for them, so it's all teed up when you get the information over to them. We oftentimes have good relationships with a certain person over at a payer's, and oftentimes they're an admin person, unfortunately. And perhaps you have to, utilize them, utilize your resource, utilize your contacts, present the case to them, but ask them to take it up the ladder, in the correct fashion. For example, something like Exparel or like the knee replacement, something like that. You have to get in front of the medical director and the medical team, and I mentioned already getting the key players involved on your side. Ask to have a meeting, preferably at your center, where you can outline that clinical pathway, and their doctors can talk to your doctors. When you have an MD on your side, it makes a world of difference. And so again, make sure you're in front of the right person. Accelerate this up to the medical team if possible, and I think you'll have some good results there. The only thing I'll mention, and I'm a little biased because I'm president of our state association, but we oftentimes network and come together and talk about issues we're having. I think it's important if you have the ability to have strength in numbers and present kind of a unified force where there's going to be a larger impact. Pull your data together, present that, and if you're coming as a larger group, sometimes you can have some positive effect there as well.
Thank you, Greg. I'd really like to ask Kevin to weigh in on his thoughts on what factors seem to influence the duration of negotiations the most, based upon both your provider and payer experience.
Sure, thanks, Naya. There's a lot of factors that can influence the duration of negotiations. In my experience, I think mitigating delays is probably one of the biggest influencers on the timeline that Greg and you, Naya, that have referenced previously. So, Greg mentioned a couple of good items, things like, make sure you're building a healthy relationship with someone at the health plan. Also make sure you understand your market pricing so that you can help justify your business ask. So nothing will slow down the process if you can't justify the rates for which you're requesting. And then also, when you're presenting with the payer, make sure you understand the goals of the payer and how your ask is going to help them bend the total cost curve. Also, deliver concise requests from the outset. Try to avoid any kind of last-minute changes or requests if possible. And then, as Greg mentioned, be prepared to educate. Part of this process is to help the health plan understand what you're asking for, and so they may not fully be, privy to all the details. But then also thinking about trying to anticipate questions that they will ask. Try not to have too many "I'll get back to you" situations. But ultimately, like I said, this is helping. All of this information goes to the payer and helps them build their internal buy-off for your request. So do as much homework for them as you can. I think that's the most effective way to influence the duration negotiation. Thanks, Naya.
Kevin, I just wanted to add or ask you to comment on the influence of duration negotiations. Have you seen the implications of who you're actually negotiating with and the level of the person you're negotiating with at the payer? Maybe you can comment a little bit on that, specifically in the ASC space, on how do you get to the right person and how that impacts the negotiations.
Sure, that's a challenging one. Not all health plans are structured this way, but in the ASCs, we typically fall to an ancillary contractor who may not be the head of the market or a manager. And so it does require a little bit of appropriate and professional networking, if you will, to make sure that you have either a decision maker in front of you or at their disposal. There's it was just as recently as yesterday, a meeting with the plan, and my request from them was they need to take it back and talk to a manager. So those, getting to the right person is key. And it's not always the easiest, but certainly worth pursuing.
Great, thank you so much. And now I want to just go over on slide 23, the indication for Exparel. Exparel is indicated for single dose infiltration in adults to produce post-surgical local analgesia, and as an interscalene brachial plexus nerve block to produce post-surgical regional analgesia. Safety and efficacy have not been established in other nerve blocks. There's additional safety information included, and now I'd like to turn it back over for questions and answers from the audience, to the audience.
Thank you, Naya, for leading that fantastic presentation. We will now begin today's question and answer session for audience questions. Please submit any questions you have by typing them into your control panel in the space labeled "Enter a question for staff" and clicking send. We'll get through as many as we can. So we've got some great questions here. The first one I'm going to throw out there is this attendee would like to know, what are the options for a practice that has not renegotiated their rates for about 10?
Could you repeat the question?
Yeah, the attendee would like to know, what are the options for a practice who has not renegotiated their rates for about 10 years?
Kevin, do you want to take that?
Sure, certainly. Brian, good question. I think the challenge is you be realistic. Make sure it's incumbent upon the provider to reach out for those rate requests. And so by missing 10 years, it's difficult to make up that time frame in one negotiation. So again, make sure you have realistic expectations as far as what you can get, or targeting rather. The ways to get there, though, will vary. Long-term relationships, from a negotiation perspective, and there's always, if appropriate, termination to reset your baseline. Those are pretty much the options that you have available for you.
Yeah, and I'll add to that as well. Totally agree with Kevin 1,000%. You can't ask a payer to make up for your lost time. That's why it's very important to understand your contract term and always have flags and knowing when your contract's up for renegotiation. But if you've got contracts that are that old, you're probably looking at renegotiating over time period to resolve for the lag times. but you may experience that you have to consider termination, as Kevin said. So, do you want to go on to
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for laying out those options. So we've got another attendee here. This seems like a good question to go with. So on average, what percentage over Medicare do commercial payers typically pay for ASCs?
You know, I'm going to answer this question because I think it was posed even in session 1, and it's the same answer I stated there. The percentage of Medicare is, again, I want to remind everybody that most payers do not pay 100% off of Medicare. And in fact, the majority of payers in this country have a proprietary payment system. It's really important to look at the payment methodology relative to what it equates to in terms of Medicare. I would just about not guarantee, but suspect you will find that depending upon your case mix, the percentage of Medicare will vary and may vary across the service lines. So you might, and also depends upon whether or not they pay for implants separately or it's included, and how they pay for multiple procedure logic. Therefore, the percentage of Medicare is absolutely dependent upon your case mix and absolutely dependent upon what the needs are of the facility. And I hate to not answer this question, but I don't think there's one answer to it. And Kevin, if you want to weigh in based upon your experience, that would be great.
No, I think you certainly covered it. You know, I would add in that geographic differences certainly would have an influence on that as well.
Great, thank you both. So we've got a bunch of great questions coming in here, and the next one I'll roll with is, so during your process of starting your ASC, did you utilize a single case agreement upon approval of TKR?
So,
Greg,
yeah, you want me to jump in there? Sure. So we are, we talked about the first webinar, if you missed, we talked about how, you know, different payers pay, you know, again, according to Medicare or et cetera. So we did go for case rates, but, you know, we had to be cognizant of they're paying for implants or not, and if that's done separately. So different payers, we could go to them with a different case rate. But yeah, I think it's important. The answer would be, I think it's important to go to them with, you know, one number that's kind of inclusive of all. I think as opposed to maybe some other orthopedic procedures, joint arthroplasty is pretty standard with what you use. I mean, there's not much variation besides the actual size of the implant you put into somebody, but even those are usually the same cost across the board. So the equipment you use, the supplies you use, they're pretty standard routine procedures. So I think if you have one good cost information of what it's going to cost you to do that procedure, you then can go to them with a case rate. I think that's going to make sure you're going to get adequate reimbursement. Again, because we're going up against what the hospital's getting currently. You know, and realize that our case rate's going to typically be, you know, you have to know what your case rate includes. Is it just the surgical episode for the day of? Does it include any post-op care? All that kind of stuff. That's obviously a more advanced conversation. But know your cost is the answer, and I think if you go to them with one case rate, it helps.
Wonderful. Thanks for tackling that one. And so the next question here is, ASCs are certainly a lower cost setting. Prove it to the payer. The cases need to be moved from the acute care facilities to the ASC, but the payer needs the acute care facility in their network and has a long-term relationship with them. Should the ASC help craft the message from the payer to the acute care facility as to why it makes sense to move cases from the ASC?
You know, that is a great question, and it's a very challenging situation because obviously we need hospitals as well. And some of these cases that represent a significant value to the hospital and potentially a significant reduction will have material implications that the payer is quite often concerned about, and rightfully so, because we all need hospitals in our market. I think that there are certainly ways that ASCs can work with payers and work with hospitals as well on the messaging and the long-term expectation of reducing the total cost of care. And that the ASC is, working in collaboration with the payer, on that initiative to reduce the total cost of care. And that hopefully the payer, the hospital, is also focused on that, as there's a lot of pressure for hospitals to be very involved with these initiatives. And perhaps, if the hospital has an ACO contract, the ASC becomes part of their solution. Maybe subcontracting with the ASC for a surgical services that reduces the cost of care becomes a win-win for everybody. And I think those are things that, really need to be considered and are going to be more and more pressed upon in the years to come as value-based pricing and risk sharing and gain sharing types of initiatives, are put forth and implemented across all payers in the country.
Thank you, Naya. So the next question I have here, this attendee would like to know, do you have a recommendation on how to overcome payers' reasoning of low grouper reimbursement rates based on out-of-network utilization management, payer mix volume for that character, and size of facility, sort of the number of ORRs, as the excuse as to why they cannot allow higher reimbursement rates? Standard ortho cases is where we are seeing extremely low grouper rates proposed versus Medicare reimbursement, device-intensive and non-device intensive procedures. Some of our physicians come from larger ASCs in the area where their contracted rates may be higher, so it's difficult to explain why our facility is being paid less than other facilities.
Brian, this is Kevin. You want me to?
Yeah, go ahead. That was a long question. Go ahead and I'll weigh in. Sure.
Sure. Well, I'll certainly touch on parts of that. I think that the challenge that is presented when you have lower rates with respect to Medicare, as was illustrated in the question, and the difficulty of potential moving of those is you're there for right or for wrong. You're married to the original base agreement that was negotiated, and so every increase is measured to a certain extent based on the delta between where you are and where you're going with respect to the rate. And so that is an inherent challenge. And I mentioned briefly earlier termination as a tool to rebase your agreement. That may be something worth looking into and entertaining. It's certainly not a solution to all the problems out there by any stretch, but yes, making big jumps to get to a different level is challenging. So again, that ties back to kind of the base that was originally negotiated. Naya, you were going to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that is if you're doing the cases, like Kevin was saying, if you're doing the cases at those low rates, you are in the budget of the payer. And so then that impacts your total spend versus looking at what could come. And it's really hard. I always say you have to demonstrate to the payer your value. And if you're subsidizing the payer under that current agreement, then it's a cost to them if they change that rate, right? So, marching those cases out of your surgery center because you're paying to do them, and nobody wants to do that. But unfortunately, if you continue to do cases that you lose money on, that's a problem. And or termination may be what you have to do, but that also depends upon the competitiveness in the market. If there, and so you've got to look at all of these factors. And if there's other ASCs, I mean, they claim they have higher rates, but maybe there's other state ASCs that have lower rates. And unfortunately, that does impact what we would call, in the payer's eyes, the market rate as well. But if you're doing the cases at the low rates and you're asking for sizable increases, and even with a business case, it's increasing the spend with the payer. But as soon as you take those cases out of the ASC and maybe back over to the hospital, or you write a termination letter, that might get their attention.
Great, thank you. And the next question I have here is, which do you feel yields better results, fee scheduling including implants or carve out for implants?
If I'm hearing that correctly, the fee schedule is inclusive of the implant and the rate versus having a separate and distinct reimbursement for implants. That depends. If you have a fee schedule that is inclusive of the implant and it's not paid separately under a carve-out, then you've got to manage the risk for the most expensive case. And as such, if you have a case, let's take shoulder repairs as an example, where you've got one case type that might require 5 anchors and another one that requires 2, you need to manage the risk for the 5 anchors. All right, ACLs, you need to manage the risk for an allograft versus using an endo button. You know, the differences in those pricing, because the payer is asking you to include it, is what impacts it. Well, so could there be upside? You know, if you manage that risk and you effectively can negotiate to cover the cost of the most expensive case, absolutely, because you're getting that factored into the fee schedule amount. Versus if the implant's carved out and it's carved out at cost, it's moving with the cost. But a lot of payers want to see that fixed rate so that they can predict their cost. But so it's absolutely imperative you understand your risk for the most expensive scenario, because you're taking the risk when you have a fixed fee schedule that includes implants.
Yeah, Naya, if I can just add to that and echo what you're saying, this is Greg. You know, I think I would go for carve-outs all day long, just because, you know, I mentioned earlier that a total knee replacement or total hip replacement, sometimes, you know, they really take a lot of the same supplies. An implant, you know, all that kind of stuff. It's pretty standard, if you will. But I retract that a bit, because I'm sure all your docs are like mine, where it's hard to standardize. And so their costs vary amongst different vendors. And unless you can standardize completely and you know your costs exactly, I find it's very hard to do. And so if you can take that risk out, for me, I would do that all day long. I mean, you know, I find then it's nice to know your costs, or your reimbursement, you know, and then you can kind of manage that risk. But I mean, I think if you don't have to worry about it as much, because especially with other procedures, like Naya said, you know, rotator cuffs, ACLs, all that type of stuff, those implants, you can use 1, 2, 3, again, different vendors. It's just a kind of a nightmare. Now, I think on the payer side, it's a nightmare as well, because there's that administrative burden of getting those different implant costs, you know, and receipts and invoices, et cetera. But, you know, again, if you have the opportunity to do it, I'd say go for it all day long. That's my opinion.
Thank you both. And we've got just a couple minutes left here, so this will be our last question. Is there value in bundling professional and facility fees into case rates, especially for certain payer products like Medicaid?
Kevin, do you want to take that?
Sure, I'll give that a try. In my experience, the answer is no, and the reason why I say that is I'm not a big fan of negotiating pricing with our partner surgeons. We should be all on the same page, working together, but it is difficult. Now, there are some exceptions to that, anesthesia I think being one, but on the surgeon professional side, I think is a little tough. You know, certainly the value-based model will be i.e. bundle payments certainly is the direction for that. And, you know, I think there's a little different scenario when you're looking at the types of cases currently looking at being bundled. And I wouldn't necessarily roll Medicaid underneath that umbrella. But no, so I think it's ultimately to say that each scenario is unique, but pulling the two together simply to create a case rate for Medicaid is probably tricky.
Great. Thank you so much for tackling that. And thank you so much to our attendees for sending in some really great questions. And Naya, do you have any closing remarks you'd like to share today?
Yeah, I'd like to just move on to slide 26 with a few comments. Pacira Biosciences has resources available regarding the new CMS rule and reimbursement process. On the slide here, you'll see your local representative at www.exparol.com/reimbursement. And then you can contact reimbursement at pacira.com or dial 1-855-RX-EXPAROL.
Great. And that's all the time we have for today. I want to thank Naya, Greg, Kevin, and Pacira Pharmaceuticals for their excellent presentation and to our audience for participating today. Enjoy the rest of your day, and we look forward to having you join us for future webinars.